And so I was thinking, okay, this is a tribute to someone immersed in music. So I went online and I found what I hope you'll find to be a good beginning. I found the the Kennedy Center, not the Lincoln Center, the Kennedy Center hosted for Paul Simon some years ago, a Lifetime Achievement Award, a tribute to him. There were dignitaries, the President of the United States and the First Lady, and all kinds of giants from the entertainment industry were present. And Steve Martin came out to begin the tribute. And I've got a quote from Steve Martin. He said, "It is not difficult for me to stand here for a long time and talk about Paul Simon's consummate skills as a songwriter and musician, but this seems neither the time nor place." So I thought maybe I'd start with that, but then I would turn to the questions that I have for Steve. Dr. Waksman, you have held appointments in both American Studies and music at Smith College for almost a quarter century. You are a scholar, a music historian, an author, musician, and in your own words, a great lover of music. What, Steve Waksman, made you fall in love with music?
Okay. Uh, you know, I grew up in a household that wasn't super musical. My parents were not musicians. When I decided I wanted to start taking guitar lessons when I was around 9 years old, it was very much of my own steam. I wasn't like being raised by parents who were like, "You have to study this now." But I was surrounded by music in the ways that a kid growing up in the late 60s, early 70s would have been, just like pop culture, right? And I was an only child. Both my parents, my dad at the time that I was a little kid owned a liquor store. My mom often helped him. So I was left to my own devices a lot. And I think pop culture, including music, became just a thing to fill space when I was alone. When I was a little kid, that was like I had a record player from the time I was really, really little. And mostly it was like nursery rhyme records, like "Oh Me Down," stuff like that. Very hip. And then I like had some Disney soundtracks, and those were cool. I really was into the Jungle Book because it was kind of jazzy, right? And then meanwhile, like, playing with kids in my neighborhood. And it just so happened that there were some kids who were a little older than me in my neighborhood who were musicians. And so I bought my first electric guitar from one of these kids when I turned 13. And they just were turning me on to stuff. And I remember when I was like first starting to learn about a lot of music that I got into, like loud, heavy, crusty stuff, like 70s hard rock. Some of it scared me. And I remember this very distinctly. It was like so loud, and I was just like my little delicate sensibilities were not suited for it. But I think this was something that stuck with me over time, is that like I kept going back to stuff that initially I had a bit of a like shock reaction to, and would keep listening. And eventually I'd kind of adapt to it and accommodate to it, and then I'd start to really like it. And so I think, along with just like music being a thing that kept me company, it was also that I enjoyed the challenge of trying to wrap my head and my experience around stuff that didn't initially make that much sense to me. And so I've always gravitated a lot to music that issued some kind of a challenge, whether it was just a sort of sensory challenge of like overstimulation, or it was like stuff that's outside the box. I like a lot of stuff that's a bit more experimental. But I also just love the sort of sheer variety. I mean, we talked about this a little bit the other day. I started as a kid listening. When I got really into music, it was very distinct. I was in basically like hard rock. Like Kiss was the first band I was really into. Right? I was like perfect age. I turned like 8 in late 1975. That was right when Kiss was at their height, But I pretty quickly started to branch out from that. Like by the time I was a teenager, I started to listen to a lot. So, I started to read more about music. I was reading criticism, started subscribing to Rolling Stone, expanding my frame of reference, gradually started listening to jazz. And that's another thing that became really important. It was like music became a way to expand my experience, my sense of what the world was. And that is to me like one of the most significant things I can do.
And it started as an only child's invisible friend. So there you go. So you have reshaped that love that you have for music into a career in rock and pop and the academy. And some may think that the roles of rocker and scholar are incompatible. Obviously, you don't. How do you bridge scholarship and hard rock?
I mean, that's my whole career. Uh, there was never a contradiction in terms there for me. I mean, I just alluded to this, but you know, as a kid growing up, my parents, I grew up outside of LA, like in suburban Southern California. My parents subscribed to the LA Times, so we had the LA Times coming to the house every day. I would read the entertainment section backwards and forwards. It was the only part of the paper I actually found interesting. And we went into the sports section, less so now. But the LA Times had all these great music critics. Like the jazz critic Leonard Feather was like their main jazz critic during all the time that I was growing up, right? And he'd been writing about jazz since the 40s. They had I don't know his name right now. Robert Hilburn, right? Yeah, that's his name. That was like the main rock pop critic that they had for years and years. And he covered all kinds of stuff. And so I was reading this stuff, and a lot of it was like concert reviews. So I'm learning like there are people playing concerts like not very far from where I live. That's interesting. But also reviews of all kinds of music that I had never heard of before, and it piqued my curiosity. So from there, I started, like I said, when I was about 13, I started subscribing to Rolling Stone. And when I was about 14, I got the Rolling Stone record guide. It had like reviews of something like 10,000 albums. And that became like the thing I would take to the record store. And it's like, this one got 5-star rating. I should buy this record. And it's like, it would lead me to stuff I would never have bought or listened to it. So it's all to say, like, my interest in music was kind of very nerdy and bookish from a very early age. Like reading about stuff encouraged me to want to know more about it, seek stuff out. And then when I did, I wanted to dig more, and then I would read more. And it was always a kind of feedback mechanism, which is basically being a scholar, right? Being a scholar is you read, you soak up information, you try to probe more into the things you read about, you try to find more sources to lead you in new directions, and then you try to synthesize it and figure out what you have to say. I mean, what you have to say part is actually the hardest part. And it took me a while to get to the point where I felt like I had anything to say.
Do you think that's different than other disciplines, academic disciplines, where someone has a passion for something and they become scholars? But is it different when you're talking about rock and pop music?
Only because at the time that I entered academia, which, you know, I started college in 1986, I started grad school in 1990. So when I started grad school in 1990, I was in a history department. I hesitate to say this, but I guess this is part of the story. I wrote my master's thesis about pornographic films. That was a bit of a detour. You can ask me in the Q&A if you want.
I haven't read it.
After I finished that, I was like, I don't want to write about that anymore. And I had an idea to write about electric guitars. I had this idea that I had been a guitarist. I started playing guitar when I was about 9. And I read Guitar Player magazine through high school. And again, like reading, right? Soaking up all this information about guitars. And I loved learning about that stuff. And there were all these books about guitars, but they're like coffee table books with lots of pictures and some history, but like nothing that really dug deep into like how the guitar became such a hallowed cultural icon symbol in our culture. So at a certain point, I had the idea, like, I'm going to write a cultural history of the electric guitar. This is going to be my PhD project. I'm doing this as a history student at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And my advisor at the time was this brilliant historian named John Casson, was just like, I'm not sure if that's history. And I got that from a lot of people in that department. And so after trying it out there for a year, I switched to a different school and a different program. I wound up transferring to the University of Minnesota, and I wound up doing my PhD in American Studies. Now, it never occurred to me to apply to a music program. And I think if I had, I probably wouldn't have had a chance in hell getting into a music program, partly because I had had no formal training in music. And you pretty much needed that to be a music PhD student. But also because music departments in 1990, 92, 93, they were, for the most part, not having much to do with popular music. You know, and you would have found similar things like in an English department at that time if you wanted to study, like, say, science fiction, right? There were just these boundaries about what was appropriate or inappropriate for academic study. So for better or worse, I mean, I guess for better in the end, but like, I was just kind of oblivious to that. Like, I realized that there was this pushback getting, but I also was just sort of like, okay, well, if I can't do that here, I'll do it here.
So getting a master's in pornographic films is more appropriate than studying electric guitar for a PhD, is that right?
My advisor was not happy with my master's thesis. He hated it. We fought over it. I was a stubborn little guy. I don't know where I got that arrogance that allowed me to just kind of say, I'm going to do this. But I had that, probably from just being an only child. I don't know. I had enough self-confidence to just feel like if I decide I want to do this thing, I'm going to do this thing.
And we're glad you have such self-confidence. So off you're going to go in December. You're going to begin a Lieberholm International Professorship at the University of Huddersfield in England, and that new role will include the £5 million, approximately $6.6 million grant that you've been awarded to conduct a 5-year research project about how sound amplification technologies have impacted, I love this, music, political activism, our culture generally. Tell us about the Amplification Project.
Yeah, sure. And I should say, like, we're going to do this, and then I'm going to give a little presentation later on when I'll say a little more about some of the things I'm thinking about on the project. But to just give a quick preview or précis or whatever, the Amplification Project is a thing that exists in my head that I haven't fully figured out all the details of yet. It's a very, very big undertaking. But at root, it stems from a lot of the prior research that I've done, which I don't want to presume everyone here knows what all that is. So just quickly, you know, I just mentioned a moment ago, I did my dissertation research on the history of the electric guitar. I've been writing about electric guitars more or less consistently for 30 years now, while also doing other things. But I have a brand new book that just came out like a week ago, Cambridge Companion to the Electric Guitar. So I'm still writing about electric guitars. It's an edited collection. And over time, as I've thought about that project, thought about that aspect of my research, it occurred to me that, like, in my own work, I had never really scrutinized the role of the amplifier. Like, that guitar is like a kind of sexy object. It's curved and, you know, looks neat, and it's made to look pretty, and it's the thing you strum and you pick at, and it is the thing that seems to be the source of all sound if you're into the kind of sound that the instrument produces. But it's kind of a no-brainer. Like, you don't really have a lot going on with an electric guitar without an amplifier. And yet the amplifier is something that people generally just take for granted. And I mean, when I say people, I mean people who think about guitars. So there are all these books about guitars, illustrated histories of this, that, whatever. Comparatively, there's like this much about amplifiers, even like non-academic literature. And on academic literature, there's like zero. There's really like nothing. So it just seemed like a huge gap. to fill. And once I started to really think about the parameters of what a project like that would be, I realized that I didn't want to just write about guitar amps. Like there'd be plenty to say about that, but amplification as a phenomenon is so much more than just making guitars louder. It's something that's really kind of integrated into all aspects of our lives, including the fact that I'm talking through a microphone right now, right? So it's really a means to get at these very big questions about how our experience with sound has evolved through technological evolution and innovation over time.
It's a great segue to my next. I'm interrupting because it's a great segue to my prepared statement on my old school index card here. Steve, when we think of amplification, we think of electronics. But as a tourist, I've gone to these ancient amphitheaters from Greek and Roman empires and great cathedrals that were built specifically in mind was projecting voices from a pulpit or the like, and they're built out of stone, and the ceilings were created for amplification. And I went to St. Paul's Cathedral in London, where there's something called a whisper gallery. You can whisper, and someone 33 meters, about 115 feet away, can hear what you're whispering, even though it's just a little breathy whisper. So I guess my question is, what is it about the human condition has caused us for millennia to try to amplify our voices, our music, etc.? What is it about us?
I think there's different impulses that are at work in that. I mean, some of it is, for lack of a better term, spiritual, right? I mean, if you think about the kinds of spaces that we most associate with a certain kind of reverberant acoustics, cathedrals, religious sites, and those are very vertical spaces, right? The verticality was meant to gesture towards the sort of, elevation of the spirit. And I think the sound was meant to reinforce that. The way in which the sound could fill the space was meant to reinforce a sense of feeling like you are just a small speck in this larger cosmos. So I think sound has always played a really significant role in the kind of impulse that humans have to figure out what their place in the universe is. It's a way in which we situate ourselves, both materially and I think metaphorically. But then there's these other more, I think, material and practical reasons for wanting to have sound be amplified, whether electronically or otherwise. And, we are social creatures. And in order for our voices to be heard, sometimes we need assistance, or the people who are trying to hear us need assistance. And there have been many phases of human history where, the desire, the need, the impulse to communicate on a broad scale, like to a mass of listeners and not just to a small body, has been very prevalent. You can't do that without some mechanism of allowing the sound to project more than it would more naturally or organically. So whether it's a spectacle in a coliseum, or whether it's a sermon, or a political speech, these are all instances in which the desire to reach a mass of listeners is imperative. And so amplification, I think, arises out of that desire for communication that isn't just one-on-one. And that's something that I have to say is fascinated me throughout a lot of my research. Like my most recent book on the history of live music, this is a huge thing that I spent my time thinking about.
You wrote about the concert.
Yeah.
Historically.
Right. And I mean, a lot of what I try to get at in that music is why it's so important for people to gather together in crowds to experience music and what those crowds signify. And again, those crowds are only enabled by having an acoustic within any given space that allows for a mass of listeners to have some comparable experience with one. Right?
You soon leave one prestigious institution to go to another prestigious institution. For those of us who don't know, and I was among them, the University of Huddersfield enjoys a reputation as one of the leading departments in music research in the world, not in England, but in the world. Huddersfield music professor Rupert Till refers to you as a world-renowned scholar, and he says, quote, Professor Waksman's research complements all the other focused research expertise in music and in music technology at Huddersfield, and this grant will make Huddersfield one of the largest research groups studying music in the world. My question is, what is it like to leave a gig that has become so comfortable, so rewarding? This has been home for a new home. You're leaving for a new workplace, new colleagues, a new avenue from which to pursue your scholarship. What's it like for you? Is it frightening? Is it exciting?
Yes, and yes. It's trippy. Yeah, it's weird to be moving at, like, I'm, 56, right? So I've presumably got some time left here, but I'm like not a spring chicken. I've had the same job now for over 23 years. I did not necessarily envision that I was going to make it. I will admit, like, while I've been at Smith, I would occasionally keep my eye out for certain other opportunities. Smith is an incredible place to be. It's a liberal arts college, not a research university. And there was a part of me that always wondered what it would be like to have a position where research was more squarely at the center of what my responsibilities were. And none of those other opportunities ever panned out. This is that square. I mean, I'm moving to a place where I'm only doing research. I have no teaching responsibilities at all in my new position. Which I didn't even think was like imaginable. It's
a $6.5 million grant.
yes, okay, right. Even with that, like none of it seemed even plausible. This was not like, oh, I'm gonna just go do that. Like, no. It's various friends of mine have been like, you basically just won like the academic lottery. Like this is the thing that like very, very, very few people get this kind of support, this sort of recognition. I feel very fortunate about that. And so when I learned that I got it, it was like, oh, wow. Like I was invited to apply by the folks at Huddersfield. I already knew some of them, including Rupert. So they appealed to me and they were like, we want to put in an application for this thing. It's a really big award. If we get it, it's very competitive, it's maybe about 10% chance that you're going to actually get it if you apply. I was like, okay, sure. I had no expectation to get it. And then I learned in March that we got it. I was like, oh, am I actually changing my whole life because I got this thing? And then I was like, yeah, I guess I am. But I mean, it's scary. Like, there's no other way to put it. Like, I'm excited. I'm psyched. It's amazing. I'm looking forward to all the work that I'm going to get to do. And at the same time, I'm exhausted and wishing that I could push the pause button and or teleport myself to 6 months from now, where I was settled in, but I can't, And so it's a very, very big thing to contemplate, and it's not an easy transition to make. And I am confident that it will be worth it at the end. But there are times when I just look around and I'm like, man, how am I leaving? And that can apply to whatever, like whether it's my house, whether it's Smith, whether it's friends.
I think he just invited us to go with him, didn't he?
Could use some company, I'm sure.
Steve, you wear so many hats. I alluded to that earlier, and everyone here knows that you are a musician and a performer. You are a researcher and an author. You are an instructor. You're an educator. Which do you self-identify as the most?
Scholar, probably. Writer. Yeah.
Why?
I mean, it's at the end of the day, the thing that I have the most focus on. I mean, like I play guitar more or less every day, although That's what we're talking about, less so now because I have an elbow injury, which is a bummer. Um, but playing guitar for me has always been more hobbyish, recreational, not something I ever imagined that I was turning into some vocation. But like I always on some, and I mean, I am very committed to what I do in the classroom and committed to giving my students the best experience they can have in that context. But for me, the place where my brain feels most engaged is with like the scholarship where I'm constantly expanding my understanding of things and pushing myself to find new material and new sources that I haven't found before that can help me further understand questions that I'm trying to ask. And that feeds into my teaching. You know, the two things feed into each other. Not teaching is going to be weird. It's going to hopefully not cut me off too much, but I'm a little worried that not having the classroom as a place to think through things is gonna, you know, make me have to find some other avenues to do some of that same kind of work because you do something in the classroom with your students when you're just trying to get things across where you have to translate in a certain way that you don't as a scholar all the time. But the scholarly part of things really engages me. Like I pretty much spend at least some part of every day trying to push something forward, whether it's just reading a new book or whether it's looking for sources or whatever it is. I'm always engaged in that. And it informs kind of everything else that I do.
Well, your amplification project is going to allow you to work with a team of scholars. So it's going to be graduate students working with you and others on your amplification project. Why don't you tell us about the team that you will be building with this grant?
Yes, will be being the operative term. Yeah, well, so you get like 5 million pounds. It's like, well, what do you do with that, right? And at first I didn't really know how to, well, it became clear to me, like when I was first approached about this thing and they were like, so if you get this, you won't have to do any teaching, it'll all be research and you have 5 million pounds. Yeah, okay. And but then when we started actually working on the grant and it became a lot more concrete, like here's what we have to do in order to make a good request. And then here are all these rules, right? So if you're applying for this amount of money, and it's not like you just get a lump sum of money, it's like, go spend it however you want. A big part of the rubric for the grant that I was given is that 75% of it minimally has to be spent on personnel people. So, you know, I couldn't just like buy a bunch of equipment or just travel all the time, right? Or something like that. So it was really like the point of this is kind of program building. So with the chair at Huddersfield, the aforementioned Rupert, we came up with a plan. He was really the one who came up with the plan. And I was kind of like, do we need that many people? But it was partly about spending money. So I'm currently in the process of hiring 6 research fellows. These are people who already have PhDs who will join me on the project. We will, on top of that, bring in a dozen graduate students who will work on their PhDs as part of my project. So my project is going to have 19 people attached to it, all told, all funded by this grant. I still haven't quite figured out how we're all going to work together. Like that is to be determined. And I also haven't hired them yet. We're interviewing them in about 2.5 weeks. We have 13 candidates to interview. We're going to hire 6 of them. We got 162 people apply, which was actually really great, and from all over the world. So it made it clear that there's people who really want to work on this project, which is awesome. And you know, some of them study music in Southeast Asia, Indonesia. Guy who studies like music and sports in Latin America. There's like really interesting areas of specialization they have. And when I think about what they can bring into the project, it completely changes what the project might be. And so that's to me what it means to be collaborating, is that like I have this idea in my head of a project that I came up with, but because it's gonna be a collaboration, it's not just me saying like, all right, you go look at this thing, report back. I want them to do stuff I wouldn't think of.
The only certainty is that it's uncertain what it's gonna look like 5 years from now.
Yeah, yeah, but I'm excited about that part of it, but it's also entirely new to me, because in the US, we don't, and if you're in the humanities, I mean, I'm sure there are people here who know this well. We don't tend to do team-based research a lot. In Europe, they do a lot more. And so it's no accident that like, there's a support for something like this in England. There's not a single resource anywhere in the US I could think of that would ever have given me a grant of this size, but partly because the model for research that it supports is basically not something that exists in the US and the humanities. But it's much more common in England, Canada, and Europe, and the rest of the world.
Steve, your publications have earned you, well, I'll try not to be boring here, the 2010 Woody Guthrie Award for Best Scholarly Book on Popular Music, prestigious Ralph Henry Gabriel Prize, which is awarded by the American Studies Association, and more. But you also earned an invitation to be the keynote speaker at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's tribute to Les Paul. You are a music historian, having engaged in serious research on the contributions to our entire culture by the electric guitar or the concert or music genres, music technology. How does it feel to be an historian who today is being honored for your contributions to our history by Historic Northampton and a Living History series? How does that feel as an historian?
I feel pretty.
You should have sung that.
Yeah. Pretty. I mean, I am ever gracious and grateful for the recognition I've gotten for my work. There's different levels of recognition. So you win an award like, something from the American Musicological Society or something like that, and that's amazing. It's great professionally. But, why are people here today, right? Because somehow I've made my voice part of the fabric of thinking about music and cultural life here in this locality. And I have been amazed at the opportunities that have come from and for that since I moved here. Some of it, even before I got to Smith, I'd had a certain amount of surprising attention for kind of going back to what you were asking me before about like what is it like to be a rock person who's a scholar? Like, it's always been a point of curiosity for some people. So like when my first book on the electric guitar came out in 1999, it was my dissertation. I was like, okay, I got the publication, yay! And then like before I know it, like Chronicle of Higher Education's writing a 2-page article about me because of the curiosity of like, this guy just published a book on the electric guitar with Harvard University Press. How weird is that? And then about a month after that, PBS NewsHour gets in touch with me. And Carlos Santana, this is end of 99, beginning of 2000. For the 2000 Grammy Awards, Carlos Santana was nominated for like 15 Grammys because he had that big solo album, Supernatural, that had come out. And they were like, if Carlos Santana wins Album of the Year, we're going to have you on. And you're going to talk about him and the electric guitar and about your work. So I'm 32 years old. My first book had come out like a month ago, based on my dissertation. Most books based on dissertations go nowhere. And I'm like going on the PBS NewsHour to talk with Jim Lehrer about the electric guitar and Carlos Santana. How the hell did I get there, right? Like, I never in a million years thought when I was in grad school that was going to be me, right? So that had happened before I even got to Smith. So I got to Smith and some of the same curiosity was always there. And that's ultimately what led me to start being on the radio. Monty Belmonte on the river heard from a student of mine, like, hey, there's this guy at Smith who like plays like Eddie Van Halen in class. You should have him on your show. And I was like, and Monty called me up and or wrote to me or whatever, and I was like, oh, okay. And then I just wound up becoming kind of a regular presence on the river as a result of that. But I've never taken any of this for granted. I feel very lucky that somehow what I've had to say has resonated with people such that they feel like I'm helping them understand something that they really care about, which is really all you can want to do as a teacher, a writer, scholar.
Which again, keeps segueing to my next question beautifully. And, so I went to school at Temple University in Philadelphia, and we had, yay, yay. We had a 5 college program as well, and you could take courses at other institutions. And so I was lucky enough, at age 18, my first semester, I had to choose an elective, and I wanted to be more knowledgeable about jazz. So I took a course that met once a week for 3 hours at the University of Pennsylvania, where what we would do is put on a headset and sit and listen to Thelonious Monk playing Devil in the Deep Blue Sea, and then talk about it, and then write 4 papers over the course of a semester. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me because the collaboration among students. What did you just hear? What did you just feel as a result? It really put me in touch with a part of myself, my love for music, that made it make sense to me. You have no doubt impacted hundreds, if not thousands, of lives in the classroom. What did you try to bring to students in the study of music and things around music that you think it's hard for them to get otherwise?
Well, as we were talking about earlier, I think there is often this perceived incongruity between popular music and academia. And I think with a lot of young people, they have this deep investment in popular music, in the music they listen to. But it's usually kind of unsystematic, right? They like what they like and they pursue the things that they like, and it's very selective. And there's no reason it needs to be anything other, right? But like for me, one of the things I've always tried to encourage in my classes is like, there's this whole field of stuff here that's worth knowing about. And it's not just the stuff you like, but it's kind of understanding how it all fits together, right? How things evolved, how you get from point A to point B. So thinking historically about music rather than just kind of music as like all these arbitrary scattered dots that you might come into contact with, is something I've always really put a lot of stress on. That there's a certain value in thinking even almost a little bit systematically about it. And I'm not too rigid about that, right? Like I don't give students tests for that. I don't give students tests, period. But I'm certainly not asking them.
Where were you when I was in college?
Right. I'm not looking for them to write out timelines and stuff like that. But I think it's really valuable to recognize that this stuff that we sometimes are encouraged to treat as trivial is something that you can really like take as a major source of meaning and cultural value. And that there shouldn't be stigma attached to it. There shouldn't be like a sense of like, oh, that's not worth taking seriously. It's like anything is worth taking seriously if you take it seriously, approach it with the right frame of mind. That's something I very much try to impart. I also try to impart some of the fun of it, right? I mean, that's why I have often brought my guitar into class, because any music teacher does a version of this. Like it's a way of demonstrating certain musical principles to be able to actually play something in class and not just like have to throw a sheet of music up on the screen or something like that. But there's also a difference, I think, between, and I saw Jayan here, so sorry, Jayan, I don't mean to insult you, but there's a difference between playing something on the piano in class and playing something on the electric guitar in class. Like, again, that incongruity comes into play. Students are like, whoa, he's doing that. And it livens up the room. And but it also gives them a sense of like, this is how this is done. You know, and I've had, even this semester, I did a show at the Iron Horse a few weeks ago. I was able to arrange with the music department for a number of my students to be able to go. For some of them, it was like almost like their first concert, you know? That's amazing, right? And so even if I don't have them do that, like just to even play in front of some students for 5 minutes, it may be the first time they're really hearing something like that in person because they're young, right? Like, I mean, I was going to shows when I was starting about 15, not super young, but like I'd already seen a good bit of stuff before I got to college, but not, I mean, especially now, students who are entering college were like in high school during COVID.
It's also, you and I briefly were talking earlier this week, that live music is communicative. You can see how someone is expressing what they're feeling or their relationship to something through something other than words. And that's always moved me. And you can get that more with live music, a little bit harder when you're listening to it without the person in front of you.
Yeah, yeah.
I think this is a really good place to open up the conversation to others. Please let us know, raise your hand.
Well, I also was gonna just take a few minutes.
Oh, you want to do that first? Let's do that.
Yeah,
And then afterwards, I have this magic wand that amplifies your voice.
We'll need 2 minutes.
okay. So I guess with 2 minutes, if anyone has a question, they want to throw it me down. Yeah.
I'm Deb.
Let's amplify your voice.
Well, you were just leading into this, how you could, in a live concert, visualize things, but I wanted to ask, I feel like today I should acknowledge the Grateful Dead, but I wanted to
Right.
say, the Dead all summer, I know this because my son was there at the Sphere in Las Vegas. The visuals were also the amplification.
Mm.
And how will that at all be a part of your research, or how will it? I mean, many people do it, but not to the extent that the Dead have done it in terms of combining the two genres. So is that something that you'll be looking at?
I don't think that it's gonna be a real defining part of this particular project I'm working on now, because the amplification, as I'm thinking about it now, is primarily about sound, but with the work I did on live music, I would say that was much more of a typical concern. And I think the visual culture of music has always mattered a ton, whether, I mean, even just thinking about guitars and how they're designed, right? I mean, you know, that said, I mean, the first slide I'm gonna show here in just a minute will get at something very visual. Because I think with amplification even, while there is ultimately, like, to me, the significance of it is about the sound and the acoustic qualities. I mean, I may as well just flip there since I'm alluding to it, but and does this have to be turned on or something? There we go. Right, I mean, this is part of the visual iconography of rock as much as anything. And the Dead, of course, like one of the things they were known for so many years, they had a sound system that wasn't just pristine, but it was like crazy big, right? The wall of sound that they toured with in the mid-70s, it was more amps stacked up on top of each other than just about anyone had ever tried to assemble at one time. And I think that there's for at least 5 decades been this really significant way in which the appearance of the amplifier stands in for the magnitude. You know, so that's one component. And you're also alluding to like this whole other dimension of the visual production and like the light shows and such that were part of the psychedelic scene in the 60s and 70s.
I love when the Grateful Dead, they had their 50th anniversary concert, and exactly what we're talking about here, the stacks, huge stacks of amplifiers. And someone came out, because a whole bunch of the Deadheads were people my age, and said, people be careful, there's some bad acid going on around here.
You have to be careful with that. And you know, if you know anything about the lore of rock, like over here with the Judas Priest thing on your right, I would say probably like half of those amps aren't even plugged in, right? Because they're just there for show. Like Kiss was notorious for having like walls of Marshall stacks on stage with them, and there'd be a one that was actually plugged in, and like a dozen that were completely just dummy amps. It really, but I think that says something about the power of amplification and the way in which there's an odd kind of equation that listeners often make between the spectacle of the amplification and the amplifier and the sound that they're hearing. You know, whereas in fact, so much of that sound is not coming directly from the amps at all, but it's coming from a PA system that is usually more or less out of sight and much less visible. So on that score, I'm actually quite interested in the visual culture of amplifiers, because I think that, you know, orange, I have an orange amp myself right now. I think they're very visually striking. But you know, also like that phrase, right? Amplifier worship. I mean, I was saying before, like people don't, writers, scholars haven't taken amplifiers all that seriously, but like for players, these things are their lifeblood. You know? So does that get it?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, sure. So I guess, okay, let me just, I'm gonna kind of whiz through this because I don't want to take too much time, but I also do want to just kind of give you a little more sense of some of the things I'm thinking about. So yeah, here we have like amps as like these giant creatures that stalk the stage and create the sort of visual analogy to the hugeness of the sound. But one of the things that looking historically is like thinking about how these things have evolved. And like, so this is B.B. King from the early 1950s, you know, one of the great electric guitarists of all time. And you look at that amp that he's using there, and it's so modest looking, and almost like you could almost blink and miss it. And so part of what I'm intrigued with is precisely what are the underpinnings that make people feel like they need to go from that to that. You know, why was this considered not sufficient? And so to just go a little further back, this is a guy named Gage Brewer, who by some accounts might have been the first person to ever play an electric guitar in public. The guitar that he has, so the stuff I'm presenting today, for the most part, is very guitar focused. The larger project I'm thinking of doing is not just guitar focused, but the guitar is my starting point because of what I was explaining earlier, right? But this electric guitar is a Rickenbacker electric guitar called a frying pan. It was produced for the first time in 1932. There's documentary evidence to show that Gage Brewer bought probably one of the first 3 of these guitars that was ever made. He was a musician in Wichita, Kansas, right? And this guy becomes like possibly the first person to ever like play a concert with an electric guitar. So Wichita has this weird little significance in electric guitar history, and this only became known fairly recently. And you know, then it's like, well, where's the amplifier, right? Again, like this, you know, amplifiers were barely even a thing in 1932. There's one there. There's one sitting right there, you know, but they're like tucked away, right? They're not the thing to be looked at. They're like, you know, for sound, not for look. This is a very early electric guitar ad from 1929. This was not an actually functional electric guitar at all. There's no evidence that these were even produced, but the ad gives us an indication that like people were starting to think about amplification being a thing that they wanted to be able to do by the end of the 1920s. So it gives us a sense of the periodization of when things are starting to move forward. And you can see there's an amp there, and the you know, it's an ad, so the promotional rhetoric all sounds very exciting. The tone in these instruments is amplified many times through a magnetic pickup. It's like, no, it's not. It's really like you could barely hear this thing. And it probably didn't work, and that's why it didn't like take off. Yeah.
What is the difference between a speaker and or
Good
is an
question.
amplifier a speaker, but a speaker is not an amplifier?
No, that's a great question.
Could
I
you
was gonna-
repeat the question for people?
Sure. So the question is, what is the difference between a speaker and an amplifier? Or is a speaker just another term for an amplifier, or vice versa? I was gonna get at that a little bit later, but, no, it's a really good question and not something that's self-evident. A loudspeaker itself is like a distinctive device. So let me just skip ahead here for a minute. Like this is a patent from 1929 for a very significant kind of innovation in loudspeaker design. By these two electrical engineers who worked for Bell Telephone, Chester Rice and Edward Kellogg. It's very interesting, like part of this project that I want to do and then putting the pieces together is like tracing the evolution of the different pieces of what makes an amplifier. Is very complex because there's not just one thing. So an amplifier in the truest sense of the term is a device that literally like allows for a particular signal to be increased in strength. Right? A loudspeaker does not do that per se. A loudspeaker is the thing that receives that increased signal and makes it audible to a listener.
So when we were looking at those pictures of like Judas Priest with all those things stacked up, are those all amplifiers?
These are amplifiers.
They are, okay.
But an amplifier in the way that we tend to use the term with regard to like a guitar amp or a PA system amp is really like multiple things. It's an amplifier itself. It's got like a set of circuits that allows the sound to be magnified, right? But it's also a set of speakers that allows the sound to be heard. And it also needs to have an input because it doesn't make sound by itself, right? So the input comes, in this case, from a guitar, in other cases might come from a microphone. The process that's the term for the process that allows amplification to do what it does is transduction. And so transduction is basically the technical term for what happens when a vibrating sound wave is put into a system where it's converted into an electric signal. So when you plug a guitar with a cord into an amp, the vibration of the string is turned by the pickup on the amp on the guitar, which is a like set of magnetic poles, into an electromagnetic current that the cord sends to the amp. The amp receives the current. It translates that current to this through the amplifier into something that's a much louder sound signal. And then it sends it to the loudspeakers, which then transmit it back out. Right?
Okay.
All of that is necessary for an amplifier to actually do what it does. But the technological innovations happen at different times. So I don't have to be that meticulous about what I'm showing you here, but like this is an early telephone, right? This is Alexander Graham Bell's one of his earliest patents from 1876. And the telephone is basically a system where you talk into a thing and someone hears it on the other end, right? That part where you talk in is basically like one of the earliest instances of a microphone. And this is kind of like almost a prototype where you get the sound back. It's almost like a prototype of a loudspeaker, except that it's not a loudspeaker because it can't amplify out. It can amplify in. You can hear it if you hold it up to your ear. You're not going to hear it really if it's like just playing out to space, right? There's no loudspeaker in 1876. It hadn't been invented yet. There was also, for all intents and purposes, no amplifier that would allow the sound to get amplified. But there was this prototypical microphone. So there was a device that allowed sound waves to be turned into electric signals. That's like part one of what needs to happen for amplification to be a phenomenon that can exist in the world. This is a patent from 1908 of a thing called an audion, which we would also call a vacuum tube, right? Lee DeForest was credited with this invention. There were a number of people who were working towards similar artifacts at around the same time. This was really developed in connection with early radio. And the goal here was not to amplify sound into the world so much as it was to amplify radio signals that were being transmitted along lines across space and time. The innovation here, like, so it's a vacuum tube, right? This is the tube. And there's like a cathode and an anode, you know, something that receives an electric charge, something that then takes that electric charge and projects it out. And what DeForest figured out is that if you put this other little plate in between the two things, it further maximizes the strength of the signal. This is basically what allows amplification to become a phenomenon in the way that we now know it. Without a vacuum tube, you don't get amplification. But it's developed totally independently of a lot of the other technologies that were necessary to make this happen.
Did Lee DeForest and his colleagues understand that sound comes on waves?
Yes, yes. But Lee DeForest, for instance, didn't fully understand that he needed an actual vacuum in order for this to work best. So I put this little bit of text here. This is from his patent, and it's pretty, I put it up because I think it's really interesting to see. I have determined experimentally that the presence of the conducting member A, which as before stated may be grid-shaped, increases the sensitiveness of the oscillation detector, and inasmuch as the explanation of this phenomenon is exceedingly complex and at best would be merely tentative, I do not deem it necessary herein to enter into a detailed statement. So basically he's saying, I don't really know how this works, but it does. So give me a patent, right? And he actually thought a lot of the early experimentation around this sort of thing, the tubes had gas in them. And it was assumed by a lot of the early scientists and engineers working on this that the gas was actually necessary in order to allow the current to flow most powerfully. And DeForest still believed that. So this was a kind of semi-vacuum. And he actually thought that you still needed a little gas in there. There was another researcher, again, like another guy who worked for Bell Lab. Bell was like the place where a lot of the innovations really got refined, who took DeForest's invention, which was bought by Bell. They bought his patent, or the rights to his patent. And then this guy was like, actually, this needs to be a true vacuum. You don't want any gas in it. And when they figured that out, it maximized the signal much, much more efficiently and strongly. And basically what you would do, like, you know, you'd have one vacuum tube, it gets you somewhere. But like phone lines and radio cables were just like hundreds upon hundreds of these things just stretched out. Right? And that's what would allow the signal to reach listeners over thousands of miles. In an amplifier, you would have maybe 6 of these lined up that would allow the current that was coming in from the vibrations of the guitar to be received, amplified, actually amplified, and then converted back into sound out of the loudspeaker. That's basically the chain of things that has to happen in an amplifier in the way that we talk about an amplifier. So an amplifier, like a guitar amp, is really like multiple devices that have been wedded together into a single box for all intents and purposes. And each one has its own kind of history of experimentation and innovation. So for me, the key components are the microphone or some object that allows for an input signal to be produced. The guitar pickup is another version of that. The amplifier itself, like the thing that allows the signal to be maximized, magnified, and the loudspeaker. You know, and the loudspeaker, interestingly, was kind of like the last part that came up. Like this is not the first loudspeaker. I was going to show, so here's the early ones, right? The earliest really functioning PA system is from 1915 by the company Magnavox. And this is a totally, like it's probably hard to see here, but this is like a speaker or a speaker design like we would usually expect. If you were like to take off the cover on your stereo speaker, if you still have those, you'd see something like this. where there's like a paper cone that's held together with a diaphragm, like a plastic diaphragm frame. And there's parts here that allow the signal to kind of get transmitted to vibrations to be converted again into something that this diaphragm converts into audible sound. This is what's called a moving coil speaker. To get into the details of what makes this unique, I think is probably beyond the purview of what we need to do today, but it's a very innovative sort of speaker design. This is like old style speaker, like what you would have had on a phonograph in 1896. It's a horn. This is not a horn. This is something else. It's getting away from the horn. But this is what people were using when they were first starting to actually amplify sound in public events, right? And that happens basically in the 19 teens for the first time. So microphones are kind of in existence by the 1870s, but it's 40 more years until you actually have the capacity to really like amplify stuff in public, right? This is a whole array of speakers that was used. I think this was at Warren Harding's inauguration in 1921. And then from there, you get these further developments. This is like 1935 ad for a set of PA systems that would have been made available. I find this fascinating because, I mean, if you're familiar at all with amplifying devices, this range of power settings, right, from 8 watt to 30. 30 is the big one, right? Like by the time you get to Woodstock, the PA system is about 10,000 watts. And nowadays, you're talking like in the hundreds of thousands, right? But in 1935, if you were going to broadcast to a stadium, 30 watts, right? And I'll just quickly go through these. This is that early electric guitar I mentioned before. And you see the amp, right? All electric guitars in the very, very early history of the instrument, they basically came with their own amps because nobody else was making amplifiers. So the guitar companies would be the ones making them. And these things were made, this is a little quote by somebody who studied a lot of these amps. They were very no frills. You know, sometimes you couldn't even like raise the volume. It was just like a single setting. You plug it in. Oh, there's sound. Yay. But eventually you start to get more features. So this is a little hard to see, but like this is kind of a great Gibson guitar app from the 1930s. And the amp, they actually show like the back of the amp here. And so here, this is I think by 1936 or thereabouts. There's a microphone setting where you can actually turn the volume up. There's an instrument setting. There's a bunch of inputs. So you start to get, even by the mid 1930s, like there's more features, right? So the amplifier isn't just doing the most basic kind of function, but there's more of this recognition that like amplification can be a way of customizing sound, of expanding the range of options that a musician or somebody producing an event might want to employ through the device of the amplifier. By the mid 50s, you've got Fender producing like a whole line of amplifiers that all have way more features than you would have found 20 years earlier. Yeah.
Were the early amps all tube style amps?
Yes. Transistors not invented for all intents and purposes until I think the early 50s, late 40s, early 50s. And it takes a while for them to be used in a significant capacity in amplification technology like this. And as you may know, I mean, are you a guitarist by any chance?
Oh, basic.
Okay. You know, I mean, in the world of amplification, like for guitarists and bassists, like tubes are still good, right? And that's itself kind of unusual because in almost every other avenue of technology, we've moved way far away from using tubes. Tubes are very like obsolete for the most part, but in music amplification, they are still considered by many, if not most players, to be the best possible option because they're perceived to have a warmer sound, a warmer tone, richer. And part of the reason why that reputation took hold as much as it did is because the early transistor amplifiers, the solid state amps, were really badly made. Because it was very hard to figure out how to apply that technology to this function.
Steve, if I can interrupt that, I know that musicians who are performing, they often have monitors on the stage at their feet, so
Yeah.
they could hear each other or hear themselves. Those monitors, which often had tubes in them, are now replaced with these tiny little things like
Mhm.
the hearing aids.
Right.
Pricey, but are those, is the if I'm playing with you on the stage, you don't want to be there with me, but would the sound be as good with these little electronic things as it would be if it was coming out of that monitor?
I think a lot of musicians would find it to be better because it's so much more personalized, right? I mean, as I'm trying to determine like what the full scope of this project is, one of the things I'm trying to figure out is how much is this really just about music and how much is this much more about just amplification as a broader kind of phenomenon. There's this really brilliant scholar who's based at NYU named Mara Mills, who's done a lot of work on intersections between audio technology and histories of hearing and disability and deafness. And she has done some great research to show that like a lot of the real kind of fundamental research in audio technology that laid the basis for a lot of these sorts of innovations was done through developing assisted hearing technologies, like basically hearing aids. So there's like a real significant interrelationship between the personalized kind of amplification devices that people use, not for musical purposes, but just to facilitate better hearing. Yeah,
I think Bill has a question.
yeah,
So I wear hearing aids and I'm going to get some new ones in 2 or 3 months. And they have artificial intelligence
Right.
as a way of assisting the discrimination of sound. What role might that have in your future?
well, I don't know what it'll have in my future, but I think it's something that's being incorporated into audio technology as it's being incorporated into all manner of things right now. I mean, this isn't quite AI, but it's not too far removed from AI, but like a lot of recent trends in guitar amplification have involved having digitally designed amplifiers where rather than, with a tube setup, the tube setup is going to give you a particular kind of sound and that you can adjust it within certain parameters, but like basically you're limited by the material properties of the material. Transistors give you a little more flexibility. They're miniaturized. There's more customizability to a certain degree. But there are these newer kinds of amplifiers where it's like a much more thoroughly digitized sort of circuit board platform. And these are called digital modeling amps, right? So you can take one of these amps and rather than just having its own kind of dedicated dialed in sound, you can make it sound like any one of, say, 15 historic vintage amplifiers. Like you could get a Fender Twin Reverb from 1956, or you can get a Marshall from 1968, and you just push a button and the amp will give you the settings that allow it to emulate that. And I think AI is going to further encourage those kinds of developments where you'll be able to program things more, and it also maybe will even kind of like, I mean, I can imagine, I'm kind of inferring things now, but based on some of the things I've read, where it might even like kind of interpret the style you're playing and shift your tone internally, right? So that it kind of matches like, oh, you're playing a blues line. Oh, here's a blues tone, right? That kind of thing. I think AI probably has the capability for doing that sort of thing. And as with everything, it raises the question, like, do we want it to do that? Like, do we want to take some of the agency away from the musician of like, this is the sound I want, But I think that's where AI might be leading things because the digital modeling isn't even that new of a technology. It's been around for a couple of decades already. And one of the things it shows is how much there's this constant interrelationship between historical sounds and new sounds. Right? Like you use very new technology to be able to get a sound that's 60 years old. because that sound has become the standard for that's a really good guitar sound. And those sorts of things to me are really fascinating because I think they tell us something really important about how we attach certain values to certain ways of producing sound. So that's where the audio technology becomes culturally meaningful. I think I'm going to just skip back to one slide that I'll use to sort of wrap things up because I feel like it's time to wrap things up. I want to pause here for a moment. This is a little more, me getting a little more academic, but you know, what are the bigger questions that I'm trying to raise with this project? This is a quote that I draw from this very influential scholar, Emily Thompson, that for me pushes things in the direction I want to explore further. The American soundscape underwent a particularly dramatic transformation in the years after 1900. As the new soundscape took shape, sound was gradually dissociated from space until the relationship ceased to exist. The dissociation began with the technological manipulation of sound-absorbing building materials, and the severance was made complete when electroacoustic devices claimed sound as their own. When electroacoustic instruments like microphones and loudspeakers moved out of the laboratory and into the world, this new way of thinking migrated with them, and the result was that sounds were reconceived as signals. This is basically the underpinnings of the project that I'm wanting to do. Looking at the sort of bigger implications of what happens over time when sounds are reconceived as signals and amplification becomes basically the primary mediating form through which we engage with sound in almost all aspects of our lives. So it's a very broadly defined project that I'm engaging in and embarking on. There will be some boundaries put in place as I get into it, but I'm interested in asking some really big questions. And I'm hoping I come up with some answers to justify the effort.